Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next Learn with Lorna. As I said last week, I'm not live again this week, and I won't be for the next couple of weeks, but hopefully, as it did last time, everything will go out fine, and you can hear me and you can see me and everything works. So for those of you who haven't taken part in any of these before, my name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer at the Highland Archive Service. So my job involves introducing people to our collections, telling them what we hold, what we care for, and hopefully sharing some of the amazing things that we care for and hopefully making you feel as excited about them as we do. If you're watching from wherever you are in the world, please just say hello, say where you are. It's been really nice seeing people watching from Australia and America and obviously across the Highlands and different schools getting involved as well. So it'd be really nice if you've got a second to say hello to us and say where you are. Although I'm not here, there will be someone who will reply to you and say hello. So if you could do that, that would be awesome. So this week we're looking at Victorians. For those in the UK, they are one of our most influential. It's one of our most influential periods in history. It only occurred to me as I was kind of thinking about this that probably the rest of the world don't think quite as much in terms of the Victorian era as we do, because obviously it was such an influential time in British history. So as I've always do, I have trawled through my family things to find some different things to show you related to that era. I have a variety of different things in my family papers from the Victorian era, which is the sort of mid 1800s to the early 1900s, but we'll come back to the dates in a second. I have some apprenticeship letters from family members. I have some great school photographs. I know we covered education a couple of weeks ago, but just some great pictures of the children outside school in their in their Victorian clothing with their collars and so on. This is a particularly nice one of my great grandparents, my three times great, my great 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 grandparents. This is William and Emma Edwards. So that sort of classic Victorian clothing look. She looks like Queen Victoria, doesn't she? And then another one's of the same family members. So this is an excellent moustache. And this is, as I say, the same family. And that's William, and that's his wife. So Victorians kind of dominate a lot of our culture in the UK. We think a lot about the Victorian era. It was very influential. So before I start talking about some of the records that we hold in the Highland Archive Service, just to give a little bit of background information about the Victorian era, either if you're in the UK and you've no idea, or if you're out with and it's not something you study. So Queen Victoria was born in May 1819. So she had the bicentenary of her birth was marked last year. When she was born, she was fifth in line to the throne, so no one really expected that she would become queen. But then there were several deaths in the family, several things happened, and she ended up becoming queen in 1837 when she was 18. So still young. As a lot of you will know, she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and he was her cousin. A pupil at Applecross Primary once said to me, does that make him her husband? Which I've used ever since. So yes, cousin and husband. And as many of you will know or be familiar with, they had a very happy and an intense marriage. And she grieved him a lot when he died in 1861. Queen Victoria had the longest reign of any British monarch until our present queen. So she reigned for 63 years and 7 months. Not bad for someone who wasn't supposed to be queen in the first place. But she reigned for a very long period of time. As I say, our current queen, Queen Elizabeth II, overtook that a few years ago. She had a huge amount happen in her reign, Queen Victoria. It was such an important time in our history for both positive and negative reasons. And we use, as I said, we use the word a lot to describe attitudes, to describe innovations. We talk a lot about it. Some of the things that happened in the Victorian time were very, very positive. Big advances in policing, in health, in healthcare, medicine, science, transport, inventions, all sorts of things. But also a lot of things that were seen as very positive at the time, but we now kind of are quite embarrassed about as a country, things that were maybe not as positive. So things like the expansion of the British Empire, the Boer Wars, the Crimean War. So she oversaw a lot of good things and a lot of negative things. So we're going to talk, some of those will be covered in other weeks. Policing we'll talk about in Crime and Punishment Week. Education we've already covered. Transport we'll come on and cover in another week. But this week we're going to look at a few aspects of things from Queen Victoria's reign. It was an era of contrasts, as most are. Very, very different lifestyle if you were rich or if you were poor. Something, as I say, that has always been and to some extent will always be, but particularly marked during Queen Victoria's reign. So a lot of the images we associate with the Victorians are of very rich people very, very well dressed, very fancy clothing, lots of layers, lots of tall hats and so on, going out to dances, going out to balls, having social events, things like that. And that happened right across the Highlands, particularly with landowners, with other people who were quite wealthy. The other extreme, which you'll be studying if you're at school, you'll know about, and other people will associate with the Victorian era, is for those people who didn't have much money. So the people who lived in the slums, who had extreme poverty and desperation. So a lot of both of those things we associate with the Victorian era. In the Highlands, obviously, we were very much a rural area. Even Inverness at that point wasn't huge. It's still not huge, but it wasn't particularly big then, although it was increasing and developing. But most of the Highlands, obviously, very rural, and so people often surviving on the land, surviving on what was around them. And if they then became sick or became too ill to work or poor for whatever reason, they would really struggle and they would depend on the church to support them, to give them money and to help. But in 1845, a law was passed, which is a really huge key date in Scottish history. And it's got a really catchy title, okay? It's called the Poor Law Amendment Scotland Act. And this set up a group of people in each parish, so in each area, a group of people called a parochial board. And they would have a certain amount of money they would be able to allocate to people. So they could give people money if the people were too poor to work and support themselves. It would be probably really embarrassing to have to go and ask for money, very difficult. But on the other hand, the system was there, and that was a huge thing. It was, this was at the time we had no healthcare system, we had no kind of state support for things like that. And so this was a big, big change for people, that if they were poor or ill, they could go to the parochial boards and ask for help. And if they were given help, then they became what was called paupers. And so if, for the adults watching, you may have come across that in in death certificates, things like that. And that's what the word means. It means they were on the poor relief system. So people would apply to get help. So they would go to the parochial board, ask for help with money or food or something like that. They would then, the people who were in control of the money would go away and talk about it together. Do we think this person needs the money? Do we think we can give them money? And then they would decide whether or not. And then if they were going to give them support, then that would appear on what was called the General Register of Poor. And we have a lot of these in the Highland Archive Service for different parishes. Depends what's survived, but we have quite a lot of them, which show the people who were given, as I say, sometimes it was money, sometimes it was food, quite often it was boots or blankets, things like that, to help them survive. There were two ways you could get support. So you could either get indoor support or outdoor support, which meant either you would be given support in your own house, some money, blankets, whatever you needed, or you would be taken into a poorhouse. So as I say, it's quite a difficult thing for us to think about. It's quite embarrassing for people to have to go to that group of people who would be local, who would probably know them, and say, I'm really desperate. But it was the start of an amazing healthcare system and welfare system in this country. Sometimes people, that group of people would say, we don't think you deserve the money, or you've got a son and we know he's miles away, but you've got a son, he could look after you instead, so we refuse to look after you. So sometimes it could be quite a hard system. And the other thing is sometimes people would apply for help because they were pregnant, and so it would say that they were burdened with a child, because quite often that would be the case if they were a single mum or they were not able to get support from the father, and so they would claim for help because they weren't able to work. So I say a big change, and in the long run a positive change, but quite a hard thing to go through, I think. And so on the website, among the documents we've got up there for you, there's some examples of lists of poor from Wick, and there's also a photo of the poorhouse in Inverness, which many people who've been in and around Inverness will know the building. It became the Hilton Hospital, so you'll be very familiar with that building, but that was built as the poorhouse in Inverness. So that's poor relief. That's one thing that's a big thing that changed life in the Highlands during Victoria's reign. Another thing I want to talk to you a little bit is one of the wars that happened. So there was a few wars during Queen Victoria's reign. One was the Crimean War, which I'm not going to go into, but you'll be familiar with it probably because that is the war that Florence Nightingale was involved in. And so for those young people who probably won't study the Crimean War, I'm guessing, but you probably will have heard of Florence Nightingale because of all the hospitals that have been opening in the UK recently to do with coronavirus. Those ones have been called the Nightingale hospitals, and that's because they've been named after Florence Nightingale, who was a really important British nurse during the Crimean War. There was also another very famous one called Mary Seacole, but she doesn't get talked about as much, which is not fair. But the war I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was the Boer Wars. And the reason for that is the Boer Wars have a really important Highland connection. So the Boer Wars started in the late 1800s, and they were fought between the Boer states in South Africa. So these were a particular group of states run by a group of people called the Boers. So there were two of them, two independent states, and they were fighting against the British Empire. Now, as I said at the beginning, quite a lot of the time, things that we were very proud of as a nation maybe 100 years ago, we're now quite uncomfortable with that part of our history. We invaded a lot of countries. We got involved in the politics and the running of a lot of countries. And this is one example of that. So the British Empire had expanded hugely across the world during Queen Victoria's reign. And in South Africa, there was a time where they discovered, in the late 1800s, they discovered a lot of gold and a lot of diamonds in the mountains in South Africa. And the Boer states, reasonably enough, thought, well, this is our country, these are our assets. But the British Empire was obviously already heavily involved in Africa, and so we said, well, we want the British Empire said they wanted to have some of the profits from this, or all of the profits, I'd imagine. And so a war broke out. There were two Boer Wars, bloody and difficult fights. As I've said before, conflicts is never good. War is never good, even if there's a right behind it sometimes. But anyway, in the end, the British Empire won. But the reason I want to talk about the Boer Wars a little bit is because the Highlands played a really important part, even though it's not something particularly that we're very proud of in our history. The problem for the British Empire during the Boer War was that the Boers were native South Americans, and they were used to fighting a kind of guerrilla war. So they would, they could sneak about, fight in the shrubbery, sneak up on people, launch surprise attacks, ambushes, things like that. And if you imagine that and compare it with the British Army, who were there in their very famous bright red uniforms, standing there, I mean, you're going to look a bit out of place in bright red, standing in the middle of South Africa, trying to sneak up on people. And they were trained in official warfare, so they were very much, they would come in their lines and their battalions, and they would face up against an army that wasn't fighting back in the same way. So the Boers were hiding and ambushing and fighting, as I say, a guerrilla war, and the British Army just didn't understand how to fight like that. It wasn't the type of wars they had fought, during the Napoleonic Wars and other things. And so what happened was Lord Lovat, who is from a very well-known Highland family, well-known, I'm sure, to a lot of the adults watching who are maybe watching Outlander, so it's the same family, Lord Lovat. Lord Lovat at the time wrote to the War Office in London, and he said, this is ridiculous. We're never going to win this war when we fight so differently. And he said, please let me raise a group of people who became known as the Lovat Scouts. He said, let me form a group of fighters out of Highland gillies, gamekeepers, stalkers, people who are used to working in the hills, because they are already trained in stalking a target, so keeping low in the ground, tracking a target like a stag or something. They're used to watching and ambushing a target. They're used to crossing rough terrain very quickly. They're used to being on horseback. They're used to all of those sorts of skills that the Boers had and that the British Army just didn't have. And so he said, these guys already can do this. And so the War Office said to Lord Lovat, go ahead, set up this group of men. And so he wrote around all the estates in the Highlands and said, in order for us to win this war, I've been tasked with gathering a group of gillies and gamekeepers and stalkers to go to South Africa. And so he did that. And one of the documents we have up on the website for you to look at is that letter from Lord Lovat written to Aldowrie, who was Cameron of Lochiel, writing to him and saying, do you have any men that I can use to form this body of men to go over to South Africa? And so they did. And they were very, very successful. And they were the first ever army unit to wear a ghillie suit, which is the sort of loose camouflage suit that you see in films and things where the troops are hiding in bushes and things like that. So they were the first ever military unit anywhere in the world to wear that. And they then went on to become the first sniper and sharpshooter unit in the British Army. They served in the First World War, they served in the Second World War, and also they're still a part of the British Army today. So they're no longer called the Lovat Scouts, but there is reference to that in their title, but they're still a part of the British Army today. So that, in essence, won the Boer War for the British Empire, or certainly was influential in winning. So it's really amazing to me that we have that. That's from the Highlands. That's come, as we talked about in Health and Wellbeing Week. We've got loads of things that we did first that sometimes people don't know about. And so that's one thing that I just wanted to touch on, to say to you, there are some pictures on Ambala, the website that we run, which is www.ambaile.org, Ambala. And there's some pictures on there of the Lovat Scouts and some information about their history. And as I said, on our website, which I'll give you the details of at the end, there's the letter up there, the original letter from Lord Lovat writing to the estates to gather gamekeepers and gillies. So that's pretty awesome. As I say, we're not overly proud sometimes of our of what we've done. We've done some good things as a country, and we've done some more questionable things. But it's good to know that the Highlands had a role in forming a part of the army which went on to carry on serving. That's pretty amazing. The other things, as I say, there's lots of things that happened in the Victorian era that we changed healthcare radically, but we talked about that in Healthcare Week. So if any of you didn't see that, please do go back and have a look at Healthcare Week, talking about the development mental asylums, of hospitals, things like that. Policing we'll come on to, as I said, in Crime and Punishment Week. So we will touch on the huge growth and expansion of transport in the Victorian era. We'll come on to in a later week as well. But one of the last things I wanted to talk to you about this week, before I go, is some of the inventions that happened during Queen Victoria's reign. Loads of things were invented, so I'm referring to an enormous list I've got in my hand, but things like the telephone, Morse code, as I said, huge increases in the use of railways and the spread of railways. Photography really came in. Some of these things have their history, have their roots a little bit before, or they really came into fruition later. But during the Victorian era, these things were encouraged and developed and looked at. And one of the things that was the height of Victorians showing off of what they had achieved was the Great Exhibition, which was in 1851. And this was held in London, and it was to mark all of the amazing things that had been discovered or invented or done during the Victorian era. And one person who was involved in that was an engineer called James Bremner, and he was from Wick. And there's a lot of information about him up on the website for you to have a look at as well. But he invented all sorts of different things, and he had things in the Great Exhibition. But one of the things that he did, which I find most amazing, as I said, lots of things happened in the Victorian era, and you'll know a lot of the names. One of those names you'll probably know is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was a very, very famous engineer during the Victorian era. And he invented steam trains and the Great Western Railway and boats and tunnels, and was involved in making underground systems and all sorts of different things, and bridges and anything. But one of the things he was credited for inventing was the SS Great Britain, which at the time it existed in 1840s and 50s when it was built. It was the biggest ocean-going ship in the world. And the connection to James Bremner and Wick comes in because in 1846 the ship ran aground. The SS Great Britain ran aground and was up on a sandbank. And all sorts of engineers from different places, different backgrounds, tried to come and refloat the ship, and they couldn't get the ship to stop being run aground on the shore. They tried to get it back into the sea. And eventually they called in James Bremner's son, and he couldn't quite work it out and did what people have done for generations and said, I'll get my dad. And so his father came in, was the only person who could work out how to refloat the SS Great Britain, which he did, which apparently caused a lot of embarrassment to all the other engineers who'd been unable to do it. And so he was the one who made this huge, famous, well-known ship be refloated and go back into operation. And if ever, when the world goes back to normal and you're able to, the SS Great Britain still exists. It's a museum. I would heartily recommend having a look at their website and going to see them one day when we're able to. But yeah, so that was someone from Caithness. So there are all sorts of people in the Highlands who developed and were involved in what we now see as the Victorian era. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, there was a huge outpouring of grief. She had been more and less popular throughout her reign. Different things happened which boosted and dropped her popularity, same as everybody. She had had a few assassination attempts. Obviously none of them succeeded, and she lost popularity to some extent towards the end of her reign, after Prince Albert had died, and she still had another 40 years to reign after he'd died, and she was so desperately sad. And those pictures that we see of her in the black and in the mourning almost all the time, that's a long period that people became associated with her as a sad little old woman almost. even though that's not who she was. And we see from her diaries of when she travelled around the Highlands, all sorts of extracts from those diaries show someone who loved to laugh, loved to dance, loved to visit the Highlands, cared very much about it. But yeah, when she died, she had been in mourning for a long time. But the nation was very, very sad. Another of the documents we have up on the website for you to look at is a letter describing the moment that she died and how the impact that had on the country. So it was written by a young lady who had travelled from the Highlands down to London and saw everything covered in black, all the lights down the Mall, the street lights, everything shrouded in black and purple. And she talks about just the fact that nobody can speak and everybody is just so devastated and there's just black everywhere. It's quite a powerful letter talking about that. One of the things that's funny in it though is that she says, I do like this. Everybody looks much better in black. I wish we could just all stay like this. It's really much nicer looking than all the colours that you normally see. But she also describes Queen Victoria's funeral and the parades going down the street and how many people were lining the streets of all different nationalities who had served in the armies that had fought, and how there were people from India and people from all over the empire lining the streets. So it's a really interesting letter talking about that time. So as I say every week, it's a huge subject. We could cover all sorts of different things, but what I wanted to do was just pull out those few subjects about poor relief, about inventions, about the Boer Wars, things that have a connection to the Highlands and that we hold records for. So please do go onto our website. We'll put the link in the comments and go and have a look at the different things that are on there for you to see. Amongst them, there's also a letter from Robert Browning, the poet. So that's pretty awesome too. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you're able to do some of the activities and share them with us using our hashtag, which is hashtag HLH Learn with Lorna. And I hope you can join us next week. We'll be looking at crime and punishment records.